3 shattered sisters were left to survive alone, until quiet cowboys gave them a reason to live again. It was Abilene, Kansas, September 1874. The plains stretched endless and dry, the nights cold enough to freeze even the strongest heart, and every shadow carried the whisper of danger. In the middle of this harsh land stood 3 shattered sisters who had already lost more than most souls could endure. Their parents were gone, their home reduced to dust and their laughter stolen by grief. Alone on the frontier, they faced hunger, storms, and men with cruel eyes, yet they refused to fall. Fear clung to them, but deep inside burned a fragile spark of survival. No neighbor came, no lawman offered help, and hope itself seemed buried beneath the Kansas dirt. Still, destiny had other plans, because beyond the horizon, where silence rode with the wind, quiet cowboys approached carrying secrets of their own, and with them came the faint promise of a reason to live again. The sisters stood in silence as the cold September wind carried the smell of smoke from what once had been their only shelter, their ruined cabin now nothing more than charred wood and scattered ashes. And though their eyes burned with exhaustion, no tears would fall because grief had already drained them dry, leaving behind a kind of strength they never asked for. The eldest, Sarah, pressed her hand against the broken doorframe, as if touching the last memory of her parents could somehow keep them alive. But even that comfort was fading. While beside her, Emily and Clara clung to one another, their faces pale yet determined to stand in the emptiness of the Kansas plains without surrender. They had no food stored, no horses left, and no one to call for help. Only the echo of wolves in the distance and the fear that bandits would return to finish what fire had not destroyed. The prairie did not forgive weakness, yet in their stillness there was a quiet defiance, a refusal to bow to the cruelty that had taken everything. And though the world called them fragile, the truth was far more complicated, for grief had sharpened their hearts like steel. Night crept faster than they expected, painting the horizon in blood-red light, and they gathered near the last pieces of timber, whispering to one another about how to survive the coming darkness. Their voices low because danger could be listening from the tall grass. Hunger gnawed at them, but fear was sharper, and every creak of the earth beneath their boots felt like a warning that unseen eyes were watching. Sarah forced herself to speak with steady resolve, promising her sisters that as long as she drew breath, no harm would reach them, though inside she trembled with doubt she dared not reveal. Emily, the middle one, kept scanning the horizon as if the wind itself might deliver salvation, while Clara, the youngest, hugged a broken doll salvaged from the ashes, holding on to the last fragile thread of childhood that the wild frontier was determined to rip away. They knew that moving meant risk, but staying meant death, and so with the fading glow of twilight, they stepped away from their broken home, their shadows stretching long and thin across the dust. Each footstep felt heavier than the last, yet inside that weight there lived the memory of their parents' strength, reminding them that survival was not a choice, but a duty. The silence around them was crushing, but in that silence their bond deepened, and though no one else could see it, the sisters were no longer just broken souls. They were becoming something unyielding. The prairie might have stolen their past, but it had not taken their will, and as the wind howled across the open land, they walked into the unknown, unaware that destiny was already moving toward them in the quiet form of strangers whose paths would soon collide with theirs, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sisters walked deeper into the fading light, their feet aching as dust clung to their skirts when Sarah suddenly froze, her sharp gaze narrowing on the horizon where shapes moved slowly through the wavering heat of the prairie, figures on horseback that at first seemed like illusions drawn from exhaustion. Yet as the sun dipped lower, their outlines grew clearer. Men riding with a quiet steadiness, their hats pulled low, their movements calm but deliberate, and though they carried the weight of long journeys, they showed no haste, as if they had been born from the land itself. Emily whispered in fear, clutching Clara's hand, her voice trembling with questions she dared not finish, while Sarah forced herself to remain still, torn between the instinct to hide and the dangerous hope that these riders might bring safety instead of ruin. The cowboys drew closer, their faces lined with dust and silence, eyes holding stories no one could read, and though they spoke no words, their presence stirred the air with something unexplainable, a balance between mystery and quiet strength. The sisters felt every heartbeat like a drum, fear mingling with curiosity as they tried to decide if trust could be given to strangers when betrayal had already carved scars so deep. Clara's young voice broke the silence with a trembling question, asking if help had finally come, and though Sarah wanted to believe it, she kept her hand on the small knife hidden at her side, ready for the worst, because the prairie never forgave those who trusted too quickly. The riders halted a few yards away, the horses snorting against the dry wind, and for a long moment no sound passed between them, only the silent exchange of gazes where words were unnecessary. One of the men finally tipped his hat, a small gesture that spoke more than a speech ever could, and the weight of that motion seemed to push against the fear pressing on the sisters' chests. Still, doubt remained, for every stranger carried secrets and every secret could end in blood. Emily's eyes softened as she studied their weary expressions, sensing no cruelty there, only the kind of sadness that comes from battles already fought. Yet Sarah could not release her caution, for leadership demanded strength even when the heart begged for rest. The evening wind carried the faint sound of coyotes in the distance, a reminder that the plains were alive with dangers that cared nothing for grief or hope. And in that fragile silence an unspoken choice began to form. Would the sisters allow these cowboys to step closer into their fragile world, or would they remain locked in isolation, risking death rather than the gamble of trust? The prairie seemed to hold its breath, the riders waiting without demand, the sisters torn between fear and need, and in that moment destiny tightened its grip, binding paths together not with promises, but with the quiet understanding that survival in such a ruthless land sometimes required faith in strangers whose true purpose had yet to be revealed. That night the prairie sky burned with 1,000 stars, the firelight flickering across tired faces as the sisters sat close to one another, their eyes stealing cautious glances toward the cowboys who had chosen to camp nearby, not forcing company, but not drifting away either, keeping a respectful distance as though they understood the fragile line between fear and trust. Sarah listened to the crackle of the flames while her mind wrestled with doubt, yet the steady silence of the men brought no threat, only a strange comfort. And when Emily caught one of them quietly placing a portion of dried meat closer to the fire, so it could be found without words, she felt the first flicker of safety since their world had collapsed. Clara, clutching her small doll, dared to smile when one of the horses nickered softly, and the rider stroked its mane with such tenderness that even a child could see gentleness where no mask was worn. Days passed beneath the relentless sun, the sisters walking or riding when offered a place on the saddle, never treated as burdens, never spoken to with harshness, only guided with a patience that surprised them. The cowboys carried their own grief, that much was clear in their eyes, but they never used it to overshadow the pain of the sisters, instead offering help only when needed, allowing the young women to keep their dignity and their will intact. Sarah began to notice small moments, the way one of the men would scan the horizon for danger without being asked, or how another would leave fresh water within reach without demanding gratitude. And each gesture, quiet as it was, built a bridge stronger than words could build. Emily found her heart softening in ways she could not explain, for the silence of the prairie no longer pressed down like a weight, but lifted slightly, as if shared with others who carried equal burdens. Clara laughed for the first time when one of the horses tossed its head and kicked up dust, and the sound of that laughter struck Sarah so deeply that tears stung her eyes, because she had thought joy had been buried forever in the ashes of their cabin. Nights brought shadows and danger, coyotes howling in the distance and memories haunting their dreams, but waking to the low whistle of a cowboy keeping watch reminded them they were not as alone as they once believed. Trust did not rush forward like a flood. It grew quietly like a flame coaxed by gentle winds, steady, fragile, yet undeniable. For the first time since tragedy had torn their lives apart, the sisters felt the heavy silence of loneliness begin to loosen its grip, replaced by something unfamiliar yet deeply needed, a sense that perhaps the prairie, harsh as it was, could still offer more than loss. And as dawn rose over the endless fields, painting the sky gold, the sisters walked beside the cowboys not as strangers, but as companions bound by the unspoken promise that survival shared is survival made stronger. The prairie had begun to feel almost bearable when the night arrived, that reminded them survival in the west was never promised. A moonless sky pressing heavy over the camp as the wind whispered warnings through the tall grass, and Sarah's instincts stirred before the danger revealed itself, her hand tightening on the handle of her knife as shadows moved where no shadows should. A sudden crack split the silence, the gunfire sharp and merciless, sending Clara's scream into the darkness while Emily dragged her down behind a fallen log, hearts pounding as bullets tore through the night. Horses shrieked, men shouted, and in the chaos the quiet cowboys moved with a focus carved by years of survival, their rifles steady, their voices absent, letting only action speak. The storm of violence meeting the unshakable resolve of those who had chosen to stand. Sarah forced her fear into steel, holding Clara close while her eyes locked on the flash of bandits darting through the black, ruthless men drawn by the scent of weakness. Unaware that silence had its own strength, the cowboys returned fire with precision. No wasted shots, no cries for glory, only grim determination that each pull of the trigger meant another moment of life for the sisters huddled in the dust. Emily tried to calm Clara, whispering through trembling lips that they would see morning, though doubt rattled her bones with every scream of lead cutting the air. The stench of smoke and powder thickened, sparks flying from the campfire as if the earth itself had caught breathless witness to the struggle. And through it all, Sarah glimpsed one of the cowboys rise from cover, his silhouette framed against the burning light, silent as stone, firing into the darkness until the bandits cursed and faltered. The fight stretched like eternity, fear pounding with each heartbeat, yet the sisters felt a strange steadiness growing inside, as if the courage of their protectors was spilling into their own veins, teaching them that strength was not always loud, that survival sometimes lived in the quiet resolve of those who refused to fall. The last shot echoed across the plains, followed by a silence so deep it pressed against the skin, broken only by the ragged breaths of the living and the retreating thunder of bandits fleeing into the night. Sarah lifted her head, her body shaking but unbroken, eyes searching the figures of the men who had stood without asking for thanks, their calm presence now more powerful than any words of comfort could ever be. Emily held Clara tightly, tears sliding down her cheeks, not only from fear but from relief that death had been kept at bay by strangers who had chosen to stay. In that silence after chaos, the sisters understood something unspoken. Their lives had been defended not out of duty or debt, but out of a shared defiance against the cruelty of the West. And though the fire still burned low, and danger would surely return, the bond forged in gunfire was one that could never be broken. Dawn crept slowly across the battered camp, the first light washing the land in gold while the ashes of battle still clung to the air. And as Sarah rose with trembling legs, she saw the world had not changed yet. Somehow nothing would ever be the same again. Emily's eyes no longer held only fear but a quiet fire, and Clara, though still clutching her doll, carried a strength that had been born in the night's storm. The cowboys stood nearby, their silence steady, their presence unshaken. And though no words were spoken, the sisters felt a bond stronger than blood tying them together. They were no longer broken children of tragedy, but women who had faced death and refused to surrender, guided now by purpose carved in pain. As the prairie wind whispered through the endless grass, they understood that life had returned, not as it once was, but as something greater. And with the quiet riders beside them, they carried forward into the horizon, no longer lost but alive with a reason to endure.